The F train from Manhattan crosses into Brooklyn just before the sun clears the East River, and on most mornings, Marcus Hale was already inside his deli before the first car rumbled overhead. He did not need an alarm. 12 years of the same schedule had rewired his body to wake at 4:15 without being asked, and he moved through the dark of his apartment on Flatbush Avenue with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned, a long time ago, that mornings were not for hesitation. Hale's Provisions had no social media presence. It had no Yelp page worth mentioning, no Instagram with curated photos of stacked sandwiches and artisan coffee. What it had was a reputation built the old way, through consistency, through quality, through the simple fact that the turkey was always sliced to order and the coffee was always hot. The deli occupied the ground floor of a narrow brownstone on a block of Prospect Heights that had been slowly changing for years. Boutique wine bars appearing where coin laundries used to be, young professionals with strollers replacing the older Caribbean families who had defined the neighborhood for decades. Marcus watched the changes without bitterness. He had arrived in that neighborhood as a 22-year-old from Atlanta, Georgia, with a culinary school certificate, $4,000 in savings, and a stubbornness that his mother had always called his best and worst quality in equal measure. He was the son of a short-order cook. His father, Raymond Hale, had worked the breakfast shift at a diner outside of Decatur for 31 years, 6 days a week, without complaint and without recognition, feeding the same regulars, the same plates with the same care on the last day he worked as on the first. Marcus had grown up behind that counter, watching his father operate with a precision that was almost ceremonial. The eggs cracked at the same angle. The butter measured by instinct, never by spoon. The order called out to the kitchen in a voice that was unhurried even at peak rush. Raymond Hale had never owned anything. He had never needed to. But Marcus watched his father and thought, I want to own the place. He arrived in Brooklyn in 2009, worked 3 years in restaurant kitchens, saved with a discipline that alarmed his roommates, and signed a lease on the Prospect Heights space in 2012 when the rent was still something a 25-year-old with no credit history and a lot of nerve could negotiate. He painted the walls himself over a single weekend. He installed the refrigeration units with the help of his father, who drove up from Atlanta specifically for that purpose and returned home the Monday after without ceremony, because Raymond Hale was not a man who made a production of love, but showed it through presence and labor. 12 years later, Hale's Provisions was a fixture. The morning regulars knew Marcus by name. The construction crews from the nearby development sites stopped in before 7. The nurses from the hospital 4 blocks over came in rotating shifts depending on their schedules, and Marcus knew their orders by heart. He employed 3 people full-time and 2 part-time, paid above minimum wage, offered flexible hours, and had never once been taken to a labor dispute. In the neighborhood, he was regarded with the specific warmth that communities reserve for people who show up reliably and ask for nothing they have not earned. He was 41 years old in the fall of 2022 when he met Diana Reyes at a Food Vendors Association meeting in a rented hall in Park Slope. She was 33, originally from Miami, with Colombian parents and a manner that was direct without being aggressive, the kind of directness that reads as confidence in New York, where beating around the bush is a social liability. She had been working as a catering manager for an events company in Midtown and said she had always wanted to open her own place. She asked Marcus good questions about the deli business. He answered them honestly. She laughed at the right moments. He drove home that night thinking about the conversation longer than he expected to. He was not a lonely man in the way the word suggests fragility. He had friends, routines, a life that was full in the practical sense. But he was a man who had poured most of himself into a single endeavor for over a decade. And there were evenings in the deli after closing, mopping the floor in the silence of a Brooklyn night, when he understood that building something for its own sake eventually raises the question of who you are building it with. Diana Reyes walked into that question at the right moment. He did not know then that the timing was not coincidental. Diana Reyes did not rush anything. That was what Marcus would remember later, during the months when memory became a form of forensic work. The way she never pushed, never pressed, never gave him the feeling of being pursued. She let him lead, or at least she constructed the impression of it with enough skill that the difference was invisible from the inside. They had coffee twice in October, dinner once in November, and by December, she was spending weekends at his apartment with the natural ease of someone who had always belonged in the space. She cooked well, not showily, but with the competence of a woman raised in a household where food was a language. She made her mother's sancocho on a Sunday afternoon and left the apartment smelling like something Marcus associated with the idea of home rather than the reality of his own. And he recognized that association for what it was and did not resist it. She was interested in the deli in a way that felt genuine. She asked about the suppliers, about the margins, about the lease terms and the neighborhood foot traffic patterns. She offered suggestions without being presumptuous. Small ideas about expanding the catering side of the business, about a weekly prepared meal option for the hospital workers who were always pressed for time. Marcus listened. Some of her ideas were good. He told her so. And the way she received the acknowledgement, without performance, without excessive satisfaction, made him trust her instincts more than he might have otherwise. In February of 2023, 3 months after their first dinner, Diana mentioned almost in passing that a friend of hers was looking for work. His name was Troy Weston. 26 years old, originally from Philadelphia. Reliable, she said. Someone who had gone through a rough patch, a lease that fell through, a job that ended badly, but who was sharp and willing to learn. Marcus was not actively hiring, but one of his part-time employees had recently cut his hours, and the timing aligned. He agreed to meet Troy. Troy Weston arrived at Hale's Provisions on a Thursday morning in the last week of February. He was lean, soft-spoken, with the alert eyes of someone accustomed to reading rooms quickly. He answered Marcus's questions without elaborating unnecessarily, which Marcus took as a sign of self-awareness. He said he had worked food service before, that he was not afraid of early hours, and that he understood this was a place built on reputation, and he would not be the one to compromise it. Marcus hired him for 3 shifts a week to start. Within a month, Troy was working 5. He was good at the job, precise with the slicer, attentive with the customers, quick to anticipate what needed restocking before Marcus had to say it. The regulars liked him. The construction crews, who could be demanding in the impatient way of men working against a clock, responded well to his efficiency. Marcus found himself extending Troy's hours without quite deciding to, the way you extend trust to someone who has consistently given you no reason to withdraw it. What Marcus did not know, what he had no mechanism to suspect, was that Diana and Troy had known each other for considerably longer than she had implied. The word friend had been accurate in the narrowest technical sense and entirely misleading in every other. They had met 4 years earlier in Miami, where Diana had grown up and where Troy had lived for a period in his early 20s. The nature of their relationship during those years, and whether it had ever been purely platonic, was something the investigation would later work to establish with precision. What the forensic record ultimately showed was that their contact had been continuous, deliberate, and, critically, hidden from Marcus from the very beginning. By the summer of 2023, Marcus and Diana had settled into something that felt, from the inside, like a life being built in good faith. She had begun helping informally with the deli's administrative side, tracking invoices, organizing supplier contacts, sitting with him on Sunday evenings to go over the weekly numbers. He found the shared labor more meaningful than he had expected. His father had always said that you learn who a person is by watching them work, not by listening to them talk, and Diana worked with a steadiness that reassured him. He proposed in September. It was not an elaborate event. They were at a restaurant in Carroll Gardens that they had been to 3 times before, a small Italian place where the owner knew their order, and Marcus produced a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a modest thing, white gold and a single stone, chosen not for its size, but for what it represented in his family's history. Diana said yes before he finished the question. She cried, which surprised him, because she was not a woman who displayed emotion easily, and he interpreted the tears as the kind that surface only when something is genuinely felt. They married on January 11, 2024, at Brooklyn Borough Hall, with a small reception afterward at a rented space in Fort Greene. 14 guests. His father drove up from Atlanta again, quiet and present the way he always was. Diana's parents flew in from Miami. The photographs showed 2 people who looked, to everyone in the room, like 2 people who had made a reasonable and genuine choice. Troy Weston attended the reception. He stood near the back during the toasts, glass raised with the rest, and Marcus caught his eye at one point across the room and gave him a nod. The nod of an employer acknowledging an employee who has become, in some informal way, part of the extended circle of a life. Troy nodded back. Marcus would think about that moment many times afterward, the specific quality of the expression on Troy's face. Whether what he had read as warmth had been something else entirely. He would never arrive at a satisfying answer, because some things, once reframed, resist being clearly interpreted, and the mind that has been deceived cannot fully trust its own recollections of the period before it knew. The investigation that followed the events of March 2024 was handled by detectives from the NYPD's Brooklyn North Homicide Squad, a unit whose caseload that year had been among the heaviest in recent memory. What they uncovered in the weeks after the incident was not a crime of passion, in the simple sense the phrase implies. It was something more deliberate, more patient, and, in the judgment of the lead detective assigned to the case, more cold-blooded in its architecture than anything the surface of the story suggested. The financial picture emerged first. A forensic accountant contracted by the district attorney's office spent 11 days reconstructing the movement of money through accounts connected to Diana Reyes and separately to Troy Weston. What she found was a pattern that had begun not after the wedding, not after Diana entered Marcus's life, but before. Months before the food vendors' meeting in Park Slope, where Diana and Marcus had first spoken, Diana had opened a joint consultation with a financial advisor in Midtown who specialized in small business asset valuation. She had described, in that meeting, a deli operation in Prospect Heights. She had not yet been introduced to the owner. The life insurance policy was the detail that landed hardest in the press when it became public. 14 months before the wedding, Diana had taken out a policy on Marcus Hale's life, naming herself as sole beneficiary, through an independent broker in New Jersey. The policy had been arranged under the category of spousal anticipation coverage, a legitimate instrument used by engaged couples planning financially for the future. The problem was that Marcus and Diana had not been engaged 14 months before the wedding. They had, at that point, been on 2 coffee dates. Marcus had no knowledge of the policy's existence at any point before his death, or near death, as it would ultimately be classified in the legal proceedings. Troy Weston's role, as reconstructed from phone records, deleted messages recovered from both devices, and testimony from a third party, a woman in Philadelphia who had known Troy for years and came forward voluntarily, was not incidental. Troy had been brought into the deli specifically to serve as a second point of control over the business's daily operations. The plan, as the investigators pieced it together, had 2 phases. The first was the marriage, establishing Diana as Marcus's legal spouse and primary heir. The second involved a series of business decisions, supplier changes, cash flow redirections, a refinancing of the building lease. that Troy was positioned to facilitate from the inside, creating financial damage that would be difficult to trace and easy to attribute to ordinary business misfortune. What the plan had not accounted for was a malfunctioning back-office laptop. On a Tuesday morning in early March, Marcus arrived at the deli before his usual time because the inventory software had crashed the night before, and he needed to run a manual reconciliation before the first delivery arrived. He sat at the back desk, a corner of the kitchen area that served as the deli's administrative space, and opened the secondary laptop that Diana occasionally used for invoice tracking. The browser history had not been cleared. An open tab led him to a document stored in a cloud account he did not recognize, shared between Diana's email address and an address he did not know. Inside the document was a spreadsheet, column headers, projections, a timeline. His name appeared in a cell alongside a dollar figure that corresponded almost exactly to the current assessed value of Hale's provisions. He sat at that desk for a long time. The deli opened around him. Customers came in. The coffee ran. The slicer hummed. The morning moved forward with the indifference that mornings have toward the private catastrophes occurring inside them. Marcus did not move from the chair. He kept reading. And the more he read, the more the previous 18 months rearranged themselves in his mind into a configuration he had never imagined and could not immediately accept. He called no one. He said nothing to Troy, who worked the counter that morning with his usual efficiency, and nothing to Diana, who texted him at 9:15 asking what he wanted for dinner. He responded with a single word, "Whatever," and put his phone face down on the desk. The document also contained a name he did not recognize attached to the New Jersey insurance policy. He searched it. Within 4 minutes, he had the name of the brokerage firm. Within 20, he had confirmed, through the firm's public registration records, that the policy existed. It had been active for 14 months. He had never signed anything. His signature on the policy application, as the forensic document examiner would later confirm, was a forgery. Competent enough to pass a routine check, insufficient to survive expert scrutiny. By the time the lunch rush began, Marcus Hale knew most of what there was to know. The question of what he did with that knowledge, and how the hours between that morning and the following one collapsed into something irreversible, is what the rest of this story is about. Marcus did not sleep that night. He lay on his side of the bed, listening to Diana breathe in the dark beside him, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost clinical, that the woman 3 feet away from him was a stranger who had studied him long enough to pass as someone else entirely. He rose at 4:15 out of habit, dressed in the dark, and walked to the deli. The Brooklyn streets were quiet in the particular way they get in the hour before the city reassembles itself, a stillness that feels borrowed, temporary, already ending. He unlocked the front door, moved through the familiar space, and stood behind the counter without turning the lights on. Troy arrived at 5:30, as scheduled. He had a key, a privilege Marcus had extended 2 months into his employment as a gesture of trust that now felt like something extracted rather than given. Troy stepped inside, reached for the light switch, and stopped when he saw Marcus standing in the dark on the other side of the counter. There was a moment between them, brief, dense with information that neither man put into words. Troy read something in Marcus's face and the specific quality of his stillness. Marcus watched Troy read it. Neither of them pretended the morning was ordinary. What happened in the following minutes was established through the physical evidence, the medical examiner's report, and Marcus's own statement to detectives, delivered voluntarily, without an attorney present, in the same flat, emptied voice that witnesses would describe as the sound of a man operating at the far edge of what a person can process and still remain functional. Marcus had found, in the deli's utility drawer the previous evening, a document he had printed from the cloud file, the spreadsheet with his name in it, the insurance policy number, the timeline. He placed it on the counter between them. He did not raise his voice. He asked Troy one question. How long? Troy's answer, whatever it was the thing that moved the morning past the point of recovery. What followed was not planned. The forensic evidence confirmed it, and the district attorney's office ultimately accepted it. Not as exculpation, but as a factual determination relevant to the degree of charge. Marcus Hale had not arrived at his deli that morning with a weapon. He had not prepared anything in advance. The confrontation became physical when Troy moved toward the back exit, and what happened in the narrow corridor between the counter and the kitchen door left Troy Weston with injuries serious enough to require hospitalization and a surgical intervention, but alive. Diana arrived at 7:20, as she sometimes did when she planned to work the administrative desk. She walked into a scene that the first responding officers, who arrived 11 minutes after Marcus's call to 911, would later describe in court with the careful, precise language of people trained to document what cannot be undone. Marcus was seated on the floor with his back against the counter when the officers entered. He told them where Troy was. He told them what had happened. He told them about the insurance policy and the document, and the cloud account, and the 14 months. He spoke without being asked, without a lawyer, with the exhausted thoroughness of a man who had decided that the only thing he had left to protect was the truth. Diana Reyes was taken into custody at the scene. Troy Weston was transported to Kings County Hospital. Marcus Hale was handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car on the same Brooklyn block where 12 years earlier he had unloaded a used refrigeration unit off a rented truck at 2 in the morning, alone, because he could not afford to hire anyone to help him. The sun was fully up by then. The F train ran overhead. The deli stayed dark. New York has a particular relationship with its own tragedies. It processes them at speed, through a media infrastructure that is always hungry and rarely patient, and the story of Marcus Hale moved through that infrastructure with the velocity of something that had been waiting to be told. The first reports appeared before noon on the day of the incident. A local Brooklyn news site ran a brief item. Assault at a Prospect Heights deli, 1 hospitalized, 2 in custody. The framing was clinical, the details sparse. But by mid-afternoon, when a reporter at a city tabloid made a call to a source inside Brooklyn North and learned that one of the 2 people in custody was the deli's owner and the other was his wife of less than 2 months, the story changed shape entirely. By evening, it had a headline. By the following morning, it had several. The New York Post ran it on page 3 with a photograph of Hale's provisions taken from the street. The dark windows, the handwritten specials board still visible behind the glass, a detail that the caption noted with the particular ruthlessness of tabloid journalism. The Daily News followed with a longer piece that included a photograph of Marcus from the Food Vendors Association's public website, smiling in a room full of people who had no idea, at that moment, what the following year would bring him. Cable news picked it up on the second day. The initial framing centered on the assault. A husband attacks wife and employee, both hospitalized, investigation ongoing. It was a version of the story that fit a familiar template, and for approximately 36 hours, it was the version that most of the country received. Social media accelerated it, without correcting it. Posts circulated with incomplete information. A hashtag appeared, attached to Diana Reyes's name, casting her as a victim before the full picture had been established in any public forum. Then the insurance policy became public. A court filing that entered the public record on the 3rd day after the incident contained a reference to the fraudulent policy, the forged signature, and the financial scheme as context for the charges being brought against Diana Reyes. A legal reporter at a national outlet noticed it in the afternoon document dump and published a piece by 7 in the evening. By midnight, the story had restructured itself entirely around the new information, and the version of events that had been circulating for 2 days began to collapse under the weight of the facts replacing it. The national conversation that followed was not simple. It rarely is when the evidence demands that a narrative be held from more than one angle simultaneously. There were voices who focused on Marcus, on what he had done in that corridor, on the violence of it, on the question of whether a man who discovers he has been systematically defrauded and betrayed is entitled to respond with his hands. There were voices who focused on Diana and Troy, on the sophistication of the scheme, on the forged signature, on the 14 months of deliberate construction that preceded it. There were voices, quieter but persistent, who asked what the story revealed about the specific vulnerability of people who build things alone, who invest everything in a single enterprise and a single relationship simultaneously, leaving themselves with no distributed weight to carry the impact when one of them fails. Raymond Hale, Marcus's father, drove up from Atlanta on the 4th day. He was 71 years old, with the hands of a man who had worked a griddle for 3 decades, and he arrived at the Brooklyn Correctional Facility where his son was being held on assault charges with the same quietness he had brought to every significant moment of Marcus's life. The deli opening, the refrigeration units, the morning 12 years ago when Marcus had called him from a payphone on Flatbush Avenue to say the lease was signed, and Raymond had said, "Good, get some sleep," and hung up. He sat across from his son in the visitation room and did not ask what had happened because he had read enough to understand the shape of it. What he asked instead was whether Marcus was eating. Marcus said yes. Raymond nodded. They sat together for the remainder of the allotted time in a silence that was not empty. It was the silence of 2 men from the same place who understood that some things do not require narration to be fully communicated. Outside, on the block in Prospect Heights, someone had left flowers at the door of the dark deli. Then more flowers. Then a handwritten note taped to the glass that read, in large block letters, "We know who you are, Marcus." The note stayed on the glass for 4 days before the building's landlord removed it, and 3 people photographed it in the interim and posted it. And for a brief moment the image circulated as a kind of counterweight to the more complicated version of the story that the legal system was only beginning to process. The deli stayed dark. The specials board remained unchanged in the window. The coffee machine sat cold behind the counter, and the neighborhood moved around the closed storefront the way water moves around a fixed object, acknowledging it without being able to alter it. The legal proceedings took 14 months. The case against Diana Reyes moved through the Brooklyn Supreme Court on charges of criminal fraud, forgery in the 1st degree, and conspiracy, the last count added when investigators established, through the Philadelphia witness and the recovered communications, that the scheme had been coordinated with Troy Weston over a period exceeding 2 years. Troy, who had survived the injuries sustained at the deli with permanent damage to his left shoulder, was charged separately with conspiracy and fraud. He accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against Diana. His cooperation was, in the judgment of the prosecutors who negotiated it, the single most consequential factor in the strength of the case they ultimately brought to trial. Marcus Hale faced a charge of 1st-degree assault. His defense attorney, a woman from a firm in downtown Brooklyn who had spent 20 years in criminal defense and had a reputation for precision over performance, built her argument on 3 pillars. The first was the absence of premeditation. Marcus had arrived at the deli at his regular time, had not brought a weapon, had not prepared the confrontation in any deliberate sense. The second was the psychological state produced by the discovery, not as a legal excuse, but as context for the jury to understand what 18 months of systematic deception, culminating in a single morning's revelation, does to a person's capacity for measured response. The third was his conduct after the fact. The immediate call to 911, the voluntary statement, the complete absence of any attempt to construct an alternative account. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They returned a verdict of guilty on a lesser charge, 2nd-degree assault. with a recommendation for sentencing consideration based on the extraordinary circumstances established by the evidence. The judge, a Brooklyn native who had been on the bench for 19 years, sentenced Marcus to 2 years of probation, no prison time, citing the documented provocation, the defendant's clean record, and what she described in her sentencing remarks as the profound institutional failure of allowing a fraudulent insurance policy to remain undetected for over a year. Diana Reyes was convicted on all 3 counts. She was sentenced to 9 years. Her attorney announced an intention to appeal. The appeal was filed and denied within 6 months. Troy Weston, under the terms of his plea agreement, received a sentence of 4 years, with eligibility for early release after 26 months. He served 24 before a technical procedural matter resulted in a modification. He was released on a Thursday morning and did not speak to the press. Marcus Hale walked out of Brooklyn Supreme Court on the day of his sentencing with his father beside him. Raymond had been present for every day of the trial, seated in the 3rd row on the left side of the gallery, in the same dark jacket he had worn to Marcus's high school graduation and to the opening of the deli and to every significant day of his son's life that had required a jacket. He did not speak to reporters on the courthouse steps. Neither did Marcus. They walked to Raymond's car, parked 4 blocks away, and drove in silence through Brooklyn in the direction of Prospect Heights. They stopped in front of Hale's Provisions. The storefront had been dark for 14 months. The specials board was still in the window. The last week of March 2024, preserved on it in Marcus's handwriting. Turkey avocado on sourdough, roasted vegetable soup, drip coffee $2 until 9. The flowers left by neighbors had long since been removed, but the glass had been kept clean by the building's landlord, who had told Marcus's attorney during the proceedings that he had no intention of releasing the space until the matter was resolved. Marcus stood on the sidewalk and looked at the storefront for a long time. Raymond stood beside him. The F train ran overhead, and the sound of it moved through the block and faded in the direction of Manhattan, the way it always had and would continue to do regardless of what happened on the ground beneath it. He reopened Hale's Provisions 6 weeks later. He painted nothing and changed nothing. The refrigeration units his father had helped install 12 years earlier were serviced and restarted. The coffee machine was recalibrated. The suppliers he had worked with before the marriage, most of whom had followed the case and sent quiet messages of support through intermediaries during the trial, returned without being asked to. 2 of his former employees came back. He hired a 3rd person he had never met, a woman from Crown Heights who had seen the reopening announcement stapled to a telephone pole and walked in on the first morning to ask if he was taking applications. He was. The deli opened at 6. The first customer was a nurse from the hospital who had been coming in for 8 years and who said nothing about what had happened and ordered her usual egg and cheese on a roll, black coffee, and paid and left and came back the next morning and the morning after that. Raymond drove back to Atlanta on a Sunday. Before he left, he sat at the back desk where Marcus had once found a spreadsheet that rearranged his entire understanding of the previous 18 months, and he drank a cup of coffee and said nothing for a while. Then he said that the coffee was good. Marcus said he knew. Raymond put on his jacket, shook his son's hand in the way of men who do not hug easily but mean the same thing, and walked out through the front door into the Brooklyn morning. The deli stayed open. The F train kept running, and on the specials board, in Marcus Hale's handwriting, the week's menu appeared again, new, specific, ordinary, and entirely his own.